Welcome to Sound Bites, hosted by registered dietitian nutritionist Melissa Joy Dobbins. Let's delve into the science, the psychology, and the strategies behind good food and nutrition.
Hello and welcome back to the Sound Bites podcast. Today's episode is about putting protein into perspective. Myths, misinformation, animal protein, and plant-based diets, and what my guest refers to as muscle-centric health. My guest today is Dr. Donald Layman. He's a professor emeritus in the Department of Food Science and Human Nutrition at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign, and has spent his entire career interested in protein and protein research. Welcome to the show, Dr. Layman.
Great to be with you, Melissa.
Well, should I call you Dr. Layman, or what do you prefer?
Please call me Don.
Okay, thank you so much. I have been following your work since the early 2000s when I saw you present at a dietitian meeting in the Chicago area on protein, and specifically protein distribution in the diet, which was a really new concept back then and very, very compelling, especially myself being a certified diabetes educator. So I've been following your work since then. And interestingly, just a few months ago, you and I got to spend a couple of days together in Kansas because we were doing a media training with dietetic interns in two different places in Kansas. And you were speaking to the interns on protein research. It just piqued my interest again, just hearing some of the new stuff that you've been discovering through your research. So I wanted to bring you on the show. I'd love for you to tell more about your background and work, especially as it relates to protein, which I know is your life's passion, and also any disclosures you would have to note.
Okay. Starting with disclosures, as one might suspect, I have a lot of relationships with groups that are interested in protein. So the American Egg Board, the National Dairy Council, the National Cattlemen's Beef Association. So I do a lot of work with them and a lot of companies, Kraft, Nestle, and again, food companies that are interested in protein. So I interact a lot with those. As far as background, my background is very basic chemistry, but it sort of has a lot of agriculture and food background. So I grew up on a farm in Illinois, so I learned a lot about plants and animals and growing up in food. I then went off and did a BS and MS degrees in chemistry, biochemistry. And at that point, I got interested in the concept of how the body builds protein. We'll call it protein synthesis. And during my master's degree, I was working on aging, which sort of has a theme that comes back later. And from there, I decided I would pursue that and went off to get a PhD at the University of Minnesota in nutrition and biochemistry, where at Minnesota, I sort of teamed up with a group of people who were very interested and knowledgeable about muscle. So I began to sort of combine my interest in protein with a specific interest in muscle. And I kind of came away at that point with the belief about nutrition that nutrition really is focused on two tissues in the body, muscle and brain. They're technically the only two functional tissues. Everything else is there to support those two, the liver, the kidney, the pancreas, the heart. They keep your muscle running and your brain running. And so I sort of got this muscle-centric concept of nutrition, and that kind of carried over from there. At which point I went off to University of Illinois, as you indicated, spent 34 years there sort of researching protein and nutrition and, how much protein do you need? How does it change during lifespan? And also general metabolism, kind of balances of carbohydrate and fat, which are ultimately the fuels for muscle. So how do we balance all of those macronutrients? So that's kind of an overview. I have a really unusual background in that, a farm background at the University of Illinois. I was head of foods and nutrition and child development, so I have a lot of human development background. I worked in international malnutrition. I had a lot of work in Morocco and Northern Africa for a while. And I've gone on to sort of focus on weight loss and adult aging. And then I was actually Associate Dean of the College of Agriculture. So back to the agriculture background. So really diverse background from the farm gate to the plate in terms of how food impacts our health.
Excellent. Thank you. Yes. And when we were touring Kansas on our media and protein tour, I found out about your beginnings growing up on a farm, and I had not known that. And I just really think it's fascinating. And as we go through our conversation today, I definitely want to address and touch on the lifespan, because you said some things that surprised me, or just I had never heard before about, how we're going to talk all about protein turnover and synthesis, but younger people versus older people. And of course, I know about sarcopenia. I've talked a lot about protein on the podcast. Towards the end, when we're wrapping up, I'll share some related episodes and information. But before we dive in, I did also want to ask you, since you do consult with different companies, what do you say to people who feel that you're biased toward animal protein because of the companies that you work with?
Well, hopefully not too many people think I'm biased if actually read the research or listened to me. But, I certainly understand that. And I think there's a couple of things people need to understand. The first one is that the federal government does not fund food research. So the National Institute of Health, if you want to study, for example, eggs and cholesterol, they won't fund that. They basically require that the organizations or the companies that have an interest in it are the funding source for it. So we kind of get into a catch-22. If you're going to fund it, who's going to do it? Well, it's likely to be the company. And just to give an example of that, we sort of had an understanding of protein back in the early 90s. And I sent our research proposals into the National Institute of Health for 10 years, and they turned down the grants saying, we basically know everything we need to know about protein. There's no reason to study it. But I finally pursued it long enough that I got Kraft Foods and the National Dairy Council and the National Cattlemen's Beef Association to fund it. And basically that turned into the research that you now know about meal distribution and aging protein. Those led to those discoveries. So without that industry funding, we'd still be in the dark ages about protein and what we thought was true back in the 70s.
Mm-hmm. Very interesting. And I do have to say, most of the feedback I get on my podcast regarding my guest experts is that my listeners are just really thrilled to hear these knowledgeable guests like yourself who have spent their career studying and working very closely with the topic that I'm interviewing them on. But I do have a couple of people reach out to me occasionally and say that, they have a hard time really trusting everything that the guest says because of their, potential bias and working with companies. And I get it. Like you said, I get it. But I also, we talk about this a lot on the podcast, confirmation bias and limitations inherent in nutrition research, especially epidemiology. And, having worked for the Dairy Council for 8 years, I got to see inside how much science and research goes on. And the information that I was sharing out to the public and even my health professional peers was just the tip of the iceberg of all of the research that I was exposed to inside the Dairy Council. Yeah. So I'm going to get off my soapbox, but I just, I think it's important that we talk about these things, and I appreciate you addressing that.
Yeah, two things I might add to that is one of the reasons I ultimately left the university, retired, was that I realized that research we were doing was not getting to the public. And so one of the things I wanted to do, and I'll say the second half of my career, was spend more time translating basic science for the public, which is something I like doing. The other thing I would add to the bias issue, and you mentioned the Dairy Council, one of the things that your listeners need to understand is that the commodity groups, the eggs, the dairy, the beef, are under the jurisdiction of the USDA. The USDA very carefully screens everything they say and the research they do. However, food research that comes out of companies, Coca-Cola, Lay's potato chips, Kellogg, is screened by the FTC, the Federal Trade Commission. So as long as they don't say something illegal or that they're curing a disease, they can say anything they want. And so if we take eggs, for example, the USDA would not allow the American Egg Board ever to say anything about a highly processed egg substitute. They just simply can't address it. Where the egg substitute could criticize eggs for having cholesterol or something. So it's not a level playing field, and the consumer needs to recognize that the protein world is primarily commodity-based, and they're under very strict USDA guidelines as to what anybody can say about it. So there's a screening level that the consumer needs to understand.
I'm really glad you brought that up because I have done sponsored and non-sponsored episodes on the podcast with a lot of commodities. I call myself, I'm kind of a commodities girl. I prefer that over brands. Having worked for the Dairy Council and then consulting with beef. And my listeners know I've done a lot of avocado-centric episodes, and that's also a commodity that is highly scrutinized by USDA. And it's not something I mention often on the podcast, but like I said, whether it's a sponsored episode or not, all of the content that we touch on, talk about on the podcast that goes in my show notes, and sometimes even the social posts all have to go through USDA approval. And I haven't really told people about that. So thank you for clarifying some of that. It does get very complex. So let's jump into all things protein. We're going to talk about your research, and what you shared with the dietetic interns is a lot of what I'd like you to share with my listeners today. And I've lined up some questions, and feel free to add in anything that you think is important that I haven't touched on. You mentioned that you have been focusing on translating research, and let me tell you, you're very good at it. And one of the things that you said was, we've had a plant-based diet recommendation for over 40 years. So I'd love for you to talk about that because it kind of helps us set the stage and think about things a little bit differently.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. A lot of your listeners, I'm sure, are familiar with the food guide pyramid. And if you look at that and what people are eating and then look at the NHANES data, most Americans are getting about 70% of their calories from plant-based foods and only about 30% from animal-based foods. So we already have a plant-based diet. And for 40 years, we've heard cholesterol was bad for us, which we now know isn't true, but we should avoid dairy and eggs and meats and things like that. And people actually did that. They started eating a lot more grain-based things. But if you look a little deeper at those 70% of the calories that are plant-based, what you find out is something a little over 50% of those are added sugars, oils, and fats that come from plants and plant oils. And another 30% are coming from highly refined grains and in sugary cereals and things. And so if you look at that plant-based part of our diet, 80% of those calories aren't very healthy. They're basically empty calories. And so a statement I like to make all the time is we don't really need a more plant-based diet. We need a diet that has better plants.
Yeah, I love that quote from you. It's really important to have that perspective. I talk about nutrient-rich foods all the time. And to your point, if such a large portion of our diet are more of these empty calorie foods, we've got to switch that over and focus on nutrient-rich. You also said something that I'd like you to share about the number 1, 2, and 3 vegetables in our diet.
Yeah, back through the 2010 dietary guidelines, people were looking at plant-based diets and they were looking at the quality. And as you said, the quality of the American diet's not too good because of snack foods and junk foods. And basically, when they looked at it, what they found out was potatoes, primarily French fries, are the number 1 vegetable in the American diet. And number 2 turns out to be tomato sauce, primarily on ketchup and pizza sauce. And number 3 is lettuce. So less than 25% of people are getting 3 servings of vegetables per day. And the vegetables they're eating have very little nutritional value. So the reality is we're not eating broccoli and avocado and healthy plants. We're eating highly processed grain products.
Right. And recently did an episode on defining quality carbohydrates, and it was sponsored by Potatoes USA. But we do know that potatoes are a nutrient-rich vegetable. However, when we're looking at French fries being the number one vegetable, we've got to take a step back at that. So let's dive into protein. I want you to give us the 411 on protein growth versus repair and replacement, I think is, what we're talking about, protein turnover.
For years, I think we were kind of in the area where everybody felt protein was primarily for children. And clearly, children need protein for growth. But the more we understood about that, growth is actually a very slow, small process. If you take a 10-year-old or a 16-year-old at their maximum rate of growth, they're only depositing about 5 to 7 grams of new protein in their body per day. But if you take somebody of the same weight, say a 16-year-old, and compare it with a 65-year-old, they both need to replace somewhere between 250 and 300 grams of protein in their body every day. That's the repair and replacement process. So everybody has this continuous process of proteins becoming disrupted or abnormal or needing to be replaced every day, and that's throughout life. And when we're growing, the difference for growth is pretty small. And what we discovered was this repair and replacement process becomes less efficient as you get older. And we think that's part of the aging process, sarcopenia, osteoporosis. Why, as we get older, are we not as strong as our bones, our muscles? We think it's this repair and replacement process. And so that's kind of where our research began to focus.
That makes sense. And again, for the listeners who don't know, sarcopenia is that muscle wasting or muscle loss as we age. My understanding, it can start as early in our 30s, but I don't remember the specifics.
Yeah, most people say it starts becoming measurable around 40. So we did some research with a population of women who were in their mid-30s. I think the average age was 37, and you can begin to pick up some of these metabolic changes. But most people look at muscle loss, that sarcopenia with aging, as something around 4% per decade starting in your 40s.
Right. And we know, and I think we're going to touch on weight management, but we know with that muscle loss that can contribute to weight gain. And correct me if I say anything wrong, but that's my understanding. And that's also, we know that we need adequate skeletal muscle for stability and for our daily activities of life, So there's a lot of concerns wrapped up with this muscle loss, right?
Yeah. So muscle is one of our metabolically most active tissues, and it's one that's sort of voluntary. You can kind of choose to make it more active or not. Your heart and your liver and kidney kind of run involuntarily, but your muscles actually are more voluntary. And we now know that a lot of our metabolic outcomes, whether it's blood sugar, insulin sensitivity, blood lipids, all relate to muscle health. And so maintaining your muscle is very important. And if it declines, then you're losing metabolic tissue. If you keep eating sort of the same thing, then you're going to accumulate fat. And so that transition that you were kind of talking about is sort of the combination of muscle being less healthy and eating too many calories for your age, depositing fat.
Right. And the understanding is that for muscle health, we need activity, and you can talk more specifically about the types of activity. And we also need protein. And we're going to talk mostly about the diet. So I'd like to hear from you about how much protein your research is showing that we need. And I know that there's kind of an update on the current science with regard to the distribution of that protein, but also the quality, because you said some things in Kansas that really piqued my interest that I want you to share with the listeners. So how much protein are we looking at?
So the current RDA for protein is 0.8 grams per kilogram body weight, which translates into sort of around 55 to 60 grams per day. What's important to recognize is that's the minimum amount to not see deficiencies. It doesn't necessarily mean the healthy amount. And I would use an example of another nutrient, vitamin C, for example. We know the RDA for vitamin C is 60 milligrams per day, which prevents scurvy, the deficiency disease. But probably in the last year, half the people in the United States have been taking vitamin C supplements for immune response to COVID. And those levels might be 500 milligrams per day or 1,000 milligrams. So they're taking 10 times the RDA for a specific purpose. And we need to think about protein in the same way. You can probably get along, especially when you're young, at 0.8 grams per kg. But most of the research now shows that adults for health really need to be above 1. And most of the data suggests between 1.2 and 1.6 grams per kg, which is about twice the RDA.
Okay, right. And I remember several years ago, I did this 30-day protein challenge. What does that translate into as far as like an average amount of grams of total protein that a person might need?
So obviously it relates to body weight to some extent, but I usually say that the range you ought to be looking at, I said before the RDA is sort of around 55, 60, the range people should be looking at is between 90 and 160. And that obviously relates to body weight. A small woman would be on the low end of that scale and a larger male on the high end. But that's kind of the range. And when we're doing weight loss, when we're talking to adults for health, we always target being above 100 grams per day as the target for health.
Yes. And I remember asking you, do I really need 100 grams? Because I know from my 30-day protein challenge and just some tracking that I've done over the years that even though I like animal protein and I eat a decent amount of protein, I can get like 80, 85, but that 100 is a little elusive. And you said, yeah, Melissa, you need 100. So I'm working on that. And actually what I think I might do is record a little outro to add on to the end of this podcast episode that talks a little bit about how I do that and certain products that I like, so that I won't get off on a tangent here.
I agree. I understand that. And in all of the studies that we did at Illinois, we found it's very difficult to keep women above 100 grams per day. But what I would also add is we found significant metabolic changes if they drifted down from that. Mm-hmm. So we thought the 100, 95, 100 was a pretty important line. Mm-hmm. One of the subsets to that, and really where my research came in, is when we were studying the regulations of protein synthesis. We think that protein synthesis is really the key to maintaining muscle health. And as we studied that, we realized as you get older, your efficiency of that repair and replacement process goes down. And it goes down because of how the body regulates protein synthesis. When we're young, the body stimulates growth, stimulates protein synthesis by hormones. Children grow because of hormones. But after we stop growing in our mid-20s to 30, now we shift the diet quality. And what we realized was that the amount of protein it takes to stimulate that system goes up over time. So adults actually need more protein than an equal body weight child would because they're less efficient. And we finally found out that the reason for that is a specific amino acid called leucine, which gave us a whole new insight about diet quality. And from there, we learned that to get enough protein to stimulate muscle protein synthesis, you need about 30 grams, a minimum of about 30 grams of protein at a meal. So hence 3 meals, 30 grams of protein, 90 grams per day. That's kind of where all those numbers come from.
Right. So I kind of envision it as, you need that 30-gram load to flip that switch on. I want to hear more about the leucine, but before that, talk about this, ideal range and window. I remember you saying, like, back when I saw you present in the early 2000s, you kind of had this suggestion of doing 30 grams at breakfast, 30 grams at lunch, 30 grams at dinner, and then some extra with snacks or whatever. And by the way, the whole concept being most people don't get nearly 30 grams at breakfast, but most likely get more than 30 grams at dinner. And so kind of distributing that through the day. So talk about that a little bit.
Yeah, exactly. I think we did those experiments initially in rodents where we could do the mechanistic work, and then we did the human study along with a colleague, Doug Patton-Jones at University of Texas in Galveston. And unfortunately, when we did the study, we decided to use 90 grams per day, and we did the sort of American uneven distribution with 60 grams at dinner and 10 grams at breakfast, kind of the way Americans eat. And then we did 30, 30, 30. So both had 90 grams. And that worked. We found that the distribution, actually with the same amount of calories and the same amount of protein, the adults made more protein per day, more muscle protein per day. So we proved the point. Unfortunately, everybody kind of locked onto that study and said, well, the even distribution is the issue. And it's not. The way you said it initially was there's a threshold for the trigger of protein synthesis, and that is associated with the amino acid leucine, and it takes somewhere between 2.5 to 3 grams to stimulate that. That sort of turns on the trigger, and that's kind of where the 30 comes from. But we know that you benefit in your body, in many cases, by higher levels. And also the quality of the protein matters. So, for example, you can get 2.5 grams of leucine with 23 grams of whey protein, but it takes 33 grams of soy protein, and it takes 40 grams of wheat gluten. So proteins aren't all alike. You can get the amino acid from any of the proteins, and you'll often hear products say, well, it contains all the essential amino acids. But what people need to understand is they're not in the same proportions. And some of these key amino acids like leucine are fairly low in most plants, particularly grains. Again, we sort of took an average of American diets, which if you look at the amount of protein in a meal, about 8% of that will be leucine. So 30 grams translates into 2.5 grams of leucine. So that's, again, where all those numbers come from. It's how much protein does the average consumer in a normal American meal need to have to get this leucine trigger?
Okay.
And as you pointed out, the real key meal then is breakfast. And the reason for that is, and we all know, everybody who does protein research knows that during an overnight fast, from dinner to breakfast, they may have a 12-hour period where you're fasting. During that period, your muscle becomes what we call catabolic. It's starting to break down protein to supply amino acids to other organs like the liver or the brain or something else. And so until you have enough protein to sort of trigger muscle, it stays catabolic. It continues to break down. And we think that's part of the aging process. And so by redistributing the protein from dinner to breakfast, now we can sort of correct this system. We can make it, instead of catabolic, we can make it anabolic and start repairing and replacing protein right away in the breakfast, as opposed to waiting clear till dinner to do it.
Very interesting. And it sounds like we don't really need to worry too much about counting grams of leucine if we're getting 30 grams of high quality protein, which you're going to talk a little bit more about.
Exactly.
So if I have the typical breakfast and maybe I have 10 grams of protein and maybe a chunk of that is plant protein, my body's not even really using that, right?
Well, that's not quite true. Your muscle can't use it. So your liver and your GI tract and sort of other lean tissues will use those amino acids, but it's not enough to protect your muscle. And we know that in the aging process, it's really the muscle that we have to worry about protecting.
Okay.
Earlier, we talked about this 250 grams of new protein the body has to make per day. Well, 75% of that is organs. It's the kidney and the liver and your heart. They get first priority because if they're not being protected, you die right away. Muscle, while it makes up 50% of body protein, only gets 25% of this daily turnover. And it's much more specific. It's much more dependent on the quality of the diet to be sure we protect it. And so we've got this sort of immediate need for organs versus the long-term need for aging. And that's where all of this protein research is focused, is how do we protect the aging process?
Okay. So I know you also like to say, you'll say breakfast, but then you'll say, or whatever your first meal of the day is. Because, some people don't really eat breakfast, but to your point, the earlier you can get that sort of protein load, the quicker you're going to switch from catabolic to anabolic.
Exactly. So, the worst of all worlds is only having one meal like at dinner. So at 7 o'clock, the effect of a meal on muscle protein turnover, on muscle health, only lasts about 2 hours. So if your only meal with adequate protein is dinner, that means you're spending 22 hours a day in this catabolic state, breaking down muscle, and only 2 hours in the anabolic state. So what we want to do is spread that out. We want breakfast as soon as your first meal, as soon as you want to have it, we want to get you anabolic. Now, instead of just 2 hours, we have the potential to spend 8 hours or something in an anabolic period. And, if you translate that into bodybuilders may very well go to 4 meals per day. Mm-hmm. They want to keep adding these anabolic 2-hour periods.
Mm-hmm. That makes sense. Maybe this is a good time to ask you, since we're talking about timing of meals and having more hours in the anabolic phase. So that begs the question, what you think about intermittent fasting, fasting in general.
Fasting, again, is an age issue. I think that a 20, 30-year-old can fast pretty healthy. That's why the military uses 20 and 30-year-olds, because they can go out in the field with severe food restriction and come back and be perfectly healthy. But we've already talked about adults as they get beyond 40. Now we're into what ultimately is the catabolic period. I don't think that adults beyond 40 should ever fast. We know from studies of bed rest, we know from studies of starvation, that if you compare a 20-year-old with a 60-year-old, say, for example, bed rest, a 60-year-old will lose 3 times the muscle mass in a week that a 20-year-old will lose, and they won't regain it. And so the problem with fasting for adults, people over 40, is that it tends to be a negative process. So any ideas that it somehow is a cleanse or making your metabolism more efficient simply isn't true. It might work for a 25-year-old, but it won't work for a 60-year-old. So I don't like fasting or starvation kinds of things. On the other hand, there's something known as time-restricted eating, where you simply shorten your eating periods to a smaller part of the day. And that's why, your comment earlier, I tend to not try to use the word breakfast meal. If you want to use a time-restricted eating, for example, not having your first meal till, say, 10:30 or 11 in the morning, and only having 2 meals per day as a way of controlling calories, I'm totally on board with that. I think that's perfectly fine. The other variable in this you touched on earlier is physical activity. The more physically active you are, the more flexibility you have. If you're highly sedentary, then your meal pattern needs to be even more carefully planned, and I would favor more of the 3 meal per day with more distribution.
Right. I remember having this conversation with you, and it seemed a little counterintuitive at first, but it makes sense when you really think about it. The more active a person is, especially if they're doing strength training, you still need that 30-gram protein load to flip that switch. But because you're doing the activity, it's using the protein more efficiently. Is that a good way to say it?
I would suggest to your listeners to try and think of it as a U-shaped curve. At the very low end of exercise, your protein needs go up because your muscle's pretty inefficient. If we're sort of normal activity in the middle, it's kind of a lower level. And then if you're trying to be a super athlete, again, really high intense exercise, your protein needs go up again.
Okay.
So it's kind of U-shaped.
Interesting.
So without getting into too much mechanism, this regulation in muscle that I've mentioned, leucine, there's actually a variety of things the muscle is looking at. It's integrating signals. And it's integrating a signal from exercise, particularly muscle stretch, resistance exercise, with protein and hormones like insulin. it's integrating all these signals. And if you have a good exercise signal, you actually need a little less leucine to make it work.
Okay.
One of the pieces of research that has been done quite a lot is that I've just argued about 30 grams for breakfast. So most people aren't exercising when they wake up in the morning. But if you look at protein right after exercise, we know that between 15 and 20 grams of protein will turn on protein synthesis after exercise. So that's a good example that exercise makes the system more sensitive.
Okay. Very good. So back to the intermittent fasting just real quick. So if you're shortening your window of eating, you're lengthening that window of being in that catabolic state. So how does that work?
So you're talking about trade-offs here. What's your bigger issue? Is it obesity or is it muscle loss? And so what you're doing by shortening your time-restricted feeding is you're kind of getting a compromise there. You're trying to maximize your first meal and your last meal, breakfast and dinner. You're kind of eliminating your lunch meal, and you're now reducing your calories. So that's kind of a concept we used in weight loss. Now you're trying to get the most efficient outcome for muscle, but with the least calories. And so you're kind of balancing that. Again, if you're a bodybuilder or a weightlifter, you probably want maximum distribution. I know weightlifters who set their alarm and wake up at 3 a.m. and take a protein shake.
Wow.
So now you're trying to expand that anabolic period. So again, you're always looking at a balance between protein and muscle health and calories and obesity.
Okay.
And that's why you sort of can do that. One of the other things, we've talked about this even distribution. What we know for 100% sure is that first meal and the last meal affect protein synthesis. To my knowledge, there has never been a study of lunch. So that first study that Doug Patton-Jones and I did with an even distribution, I think the effect is all of the first meal. I think that, again, as I said, your meal only gives you a 2-hour effect. So whether that 2-hour effect occurred at 7 in the morning or whether it occurred at 11 in the morning, I don't think it matters.
Okay.
Again, there's this 2-hour window with the meal that you're anabolic, you're absorptive. And so again, if you have your breakfast at 7, you're absorptive from 7 to 9, you're anabolic. Or if you have it at 11, it's from 11 to 1. It's still only 2 hours. So I'm not sure there's a difference.
Okay. Yeah, that's interesting.
Bob Wolf and a couple of other people have done some studies kind of supporting that. But like I said, to my knowledge, nobody's ever looked at lunch. We're just assuming that's important, but nobody's ever studied it.
Very interesting. Okay, so what else do we need to know about leucine? And I know there's some other amino acids you might want to touch on. And then really being clear about animal proteins versus plant proteins. I really want to hear more about that.
Yeah. So as we've gotten into this, adult need for protein, we now know that the protein quality makes a bigger difference. And as we raise the question about plant-based diets or vegetarian diets, one of the things that we know is that almost all vegetarian diets result in lower protein intakes. If you look at vegetarians that have been studied, most of them are down around the RDA, 50 to 60 grams of protein. It's very hard to have a vegetarian diet with 100 grams of protein unless you go to ultra-processed foods, isolated proteins like soy or pea or something built into foods, which is possible. But again, are you looking for more ultra-processed foods in your diet or not? So as people think about plant-based diets, all plants are limiting or they're low or deficient in one or two of the essential amino acids. And the ones that are most critical are called methionine, lysine, and I've been talking about leucine. A fourth one might well be tryptophan. Methionine is always limiting in legume-type products, so pea and soy. Lysine is always limiting in grain products, so corn and wheat and oats. And leucine is particularly limiting in grain products. So as we go to lower protein, with a typical American diet where Americans are eating around 80 to 90 grams per day, actually women are around 70 and men are around 90, we tend to be above the requirement far enough that our mixture of plant and animal doesn't matter. But the animal products are providing about 70% of our protein in that mixture. So if we begin to shift to the plant side, now the quality will make a lot more difference. And for example, I mentioned earlier, if we're looking at leucine for whey protein, we can get that amount with about 23 grams of protein. If we're looking at egg protein, it's about 27, 28. If we're looking at soy protein, you need 33. Wheat protein or quinoa, you're up in the 40s. So again, you can get it, but it takes a lot more protein. And unfortunately, most vegetarian diets tend to push it down. Mm-hmm. So that's something that the consumer needs to know if they're going to make those choices. One of the things I always like to use as an example is wheat cereal, which is deficient in lysine. If you take an average wheat cereal, say Raisin Bran, half cup serving has about 6 grams of protein in it. No, I think it's 4 grams of protein. And you combine it with 6 ounces of milk, you now have a balanced protein, amino acid protein with 10 grams. But if you do the same thing with a soy drink, 4 grams of protein from the wheat cereal, it takes over 30 ounces of the soy milk to get up to the lysine number. Not very many mothers that are feeding their kids soy or coconut milks or things realize that they simply are giving them an imbalanced protein for breakfast.
Mm-hmm. Right. And that's because of the bioavailability, correct?
It's because it has no lysine in it. In isolated soy products, it's not really an issue of bioavailability. It's the fact that it has very low lysine. Okay. If you're talking about natural products like beans, now you get into bioavailability. In most grains and in beans, the bioavailability of the natural product is only between 40 and 60%. So if you look at a whole grain cereal, for example, that's a wheat cereal, it might only be 40, 45% available. So if you think you're getting 10 grams of protein, you may actually only be getting 4 or 5.
So a practical takeaway from this for our listeners would be what?
I think the practical takeaway is that you're best having a combination of plant and animal proteins. If you want to have more plant, that's great, but keep your total protein high, that 100 grams we talked about, you're okay. But if you shift to a vegetarian type diet that gets you down around 55 grams of just plant proteins, you're going to be deficient in some amino acids.
Okay. And so also was curious, what do you say to people who claim that everybody eats too much protein? I know you touched a little bit on the RDA and such, but I didn't point blank ask you that question yet.
Yeah. I mean, if you look at the NHANES data, again, the RDA is 0.8 grams per day. The average American, men and women, fall in about 0.9 to 1. So we're just barely above it. But if you start looking at age, again, based on NHANES, 40% of women age 60 or older are actually below the minimum RDA. They're suffering from protein deficiency. And so how far can we push that down? The majority of adult women are very close to the RDA now, and changing their diet composition to more plant-based is a real risk. We don't know the ramifications of that. And to start talking to the average consumer about protein quality, that's a pretty big ask. I mean, the average consumer doesn't realize 9 essential amino acids in the right proportions. Mm-hmm. I like to talk about protein as a little like a vitamin pill. Everybody knows that you don't really take the vitamin pill because you need the pill. You need the 12 vitamins inside of it. Mm-hmm. But when we start talking about protein, we just say, well, it's protein. But actually, the issue is there's 20 amino acids in that protein, 9 of which are absolutely essential in our diet every day. And the average consumer has no knowledge of how to balance that.
Yeah, that's a great way to explain that. Thank you. What else do you want to share with us about protein quantity, quality, meal distribution. I know that we've covered a lot, but is there anything that is important that I haven't asked you?
I think we've covered quite a lot. I think maybe just to go back and reiterate a couple of things. I think that what we know for 100% sure is that first meal of the day is important for muscle health. And we would like to see people get into at least the 30 gram range for that. I think having a larger dinner is okay. We usually think of the sort of responsive range for protein is somewhere between about 25 grams and 55 grams at a meal. So eating more than 55 makes no sense at all at a meal. Having a 16-ounce steak makes no sense at all. But getting up to 50, for a meal per day, especially for larger individuals, is probably fine. And that the least important meal of the day is perhaps lunch. We just don't know much about that. So I always talk about the first meal and the last meal are your important protein meals. And both of those need to be above 30.
Okay, great. Thank you. Normally, I wouldn't ask about animal protein's impact on the environment for somebody like you. But since you spoke to that quite a bit in Kansas, I would like to have you share some of that. I have a lot of episodes on this topic, and I'll share those out as we wrap up if people are interested in more information. But yeah, I would love for you to address, what do you say to people who say that, animals are bad for the environment?
There's the pure animal husbandry part, animal existence. I tried to take a nutrition approach to it, which is protein. The animal proteins are very important in our diet, and trying to replace those is not an easy thing. The other part of that from an agricultural standpoint is there are huge tracts of land in the United States that are only available for raising animals. Particularly ruminant animals have a very unique role. Cattle for dairy, for milk, or for meat have a very unique role because they can eat forages and they can basically take grass and turn it into high quality protein, which humans can't do and basically no other animals can do. So that's a part of our food system that we can't lose. The other thing to realize about the United States is we're basically a northern climate country. We basically have a full agricultural aspect, and we can't change the grasslands, as you and I saw in Kansas or out in Oklahoma, into raising avocados and broccoli. They're designed for grazing cattle and raising wheat. It's important for people to know that if we're going to have a healthy plant diet, that already 50% of our fruits and 25% of the vegetables consumed in the United States are imported. And the number one cause of climate change in the United States is transportation, the primary source of greenhouse gas. So if we're going to not simply shift to more refined grains and sugar, but actually have a healthy plant diet, it's all going to have to be imported. And the climate impact of that is far greater than raising cattle. And the last thing on that is one of the things I like to think about is that if you look back in the 1800s, we have the same number of cattle in the United States today. Back then, we called them buffalo. We had about 90 million, best guess. And today, we have about 90 million domestic cattle. So basically, it's really hard to argue that cattle have anything to do with climate change. The number hasn't really changed in 200 years.
Very interesting. Thank you. Appreciate that. So I mentioned I have some related episodes. I'd like to mention what they are. And of course, I'll put all of these links in my show notes at soundbitesrd.com. Talk about protein a lot. So it's sprinkled throughout my 200 plus episodes, but some specific ones that listeners might be interested in. My very first episode number 1, was The Power of Protein with your fellow researcher, Doug Patton Jones. And then episode number 39 with your fellow researcher, Stuart Phillips, is Protein and Exercise, Partners in Successful Aging. So we talk a lot about the sarcopenia in that episode. And then I mentioned the 30-day protein challenge. I have a few episodes on that and some blog posts. That was several years ago. Also, with regard to animal protein and sustainability or the environment, I had Dr. Frank Mitlerner on in episode 143 talking about greenhouse gases in agriculture. That is an episode not to miss. Episode 171, I talk about seafood sustainability. Episode 188, talk a lot about are we eating too much meat? And then some more beef and environment, episodes 104 and 144. So check those out, and also stay tuned to the outro for this episode because I will be sharing more information, like I said, about how do I try to get to 100 grams of protein a day and some of the products that I like to use to help me do that. I'm not working for any of those companies. It's not sponsored, but if you're interested, I have found what works for me. So thank you so much for being on the show, Dr. Layman. Is there anything else you wanted to say in wrapping up?
No, it's my pleasure to join you. And, I think that the work that you do and the information you present to people, you're bringing leading researchers. I mean, Doug Patton-Jones, Stu Phillips, Frank Billhammer. I mean, these are the leading scientists, and people want to know, where to get the information, who to believe. You're doing a great job of bringing the right people to the public to hear the actual research and hear really the truth behind the stories and behind the headlines that you may see in the paper. So, I think you need to be commended for what you do in bringing it to the public.
Oh, thank you so much. And, it's been a long time coming. You've been on my guest list for a really long time. So I'm just thrilled that I got to do some work with you and spend 2 days picking your brain. And I'm really excited. I meant to mention this earlier, but I wanted to tell you that I was so inspired by you and reigniting this protein conversation that I finally got back to my strength training in early November. I hadn't been able to do it consistently because of several injuries, my shoulder, my hand, lots of things going on there. And I finally got back to it regularly, and I'm loving it. I feel so good. I feel so strong. And so I'm just really excited, and I wanted to let you know.
Yeah, the muscle part is important. And, a lot of people hear exercise and strength training and they think, bodybuilders and gyms. And I think it's important to recognize that for the average person, stretch is very important to that process. Well, we did some weight loss studies at Illinois where we just did Nautilus type machines with no weights on them. Going through the range of motion for a lot of adults is the major part of it. So yoga, Pilates, stretching, those are where to get started. If you want to add weights to it, so much the better. But don't be intimidated by the idea that you have to go to a gym to protect your muscles.
Great points. My listeners know that I've been lifting at home for decades, so I have my own little free weights, but I just got out of physical therapy, so stretchy bands are top of mind for me too. So yeah, you don't have to do the free weights. You don't have to do the machines. Get some stretchy bands. And like you said, just doing the movement itself. That's a really great point. Thank you.
Yep, great.
Well, Don, where can people find more information about protein research, the work that you're doing? I know you're on Twitter at Don Layman, but is there anything else you wanted to share with us?
Yeah, the Twitter, I don't do a lot of it, but I definitely focus on actually protein knowledge. And so hopefully people follow me, realize that I'm trying to give really accurate information. One of the things I'm excited about, though, is we're just about to launch a website. I think it'll be under a heading of metabolic designs, but we're going to launch a website talking about protein requirements and protein metabolism and some of the weight loss studies that we did at Illinois. So hopefully that'll be out in the next couple of months. I will certainly announce it on my Twitter when we start doing that. But if people are interested in following me and learning more about protein, hopefully that'll be a good source for people.
Wonderful. How exciting. Yeah. And I'll stay connected with you, and I'll add that link to my show notes at soundbitesrd.com as well once it's up and running.
Thank you.
Well, thanks again. And for everybody listening, as always, enjoy your food with health in mind and some protein. Till next time. Hello again. As I mentioned during the episode, I wanted to share some tips and products with you in the outro here. And I would love to hear how you try to boost or modify your protein intake. So please leave a comment at the bottom of the show notes page or connect with me by email or through social media. I've been interested in protein for about 20 years now, but much more focused on it in the past 10 years or so. I've done this 30-day protein challenge a few times, and in addition to that, I've tried a lot of different foods, products, meal patterns. and other tips and tricks to get my intake to go beyond the 80 grams or so that is fairly doable for me. I should say it's fairly doable as long as I'm paying attention to protein. I'm sure my intake is much closer to 50 or 60 grams per day if I just kind of eat whatever I want without making sure that I have more than 2 meals and that protein is a priority. So here are some of the ideas I wanted to share with you. First of all, I'm not a big fan of smoothies, which is odd because anyone who knows me knows that I really love my beverages and liquids. Well, luckily for me, since I'm not into smoothies, whey protein powder is easy to mix with water, it dissolves well, and it tastes great. So I just mix it with water and drink it. The kind I use is Optimum Nutrition 100% whey, which is a blend of whey protein isolate, whey protein concentrate, and whey peptides, plus some natural and artificial flavor, including sucralose and acesulfame K. I really like the vanilla ice cream flavor. 1 scoop is 120 calories and 24 grams of protein. So based on what I learned from Dr. Layman, I'm using it after exercise or sometimes as a quick and easy breakfast. But I'm doing a little bit more than 1 scoop so that I'm getting closer to like 30 grams of protein. I also love Fairlife brand milk, their Core Power High Protein Milk Shake, and their Fairlife Nutrition Plan Shake, which is very similar to their Core Power beverages. Basically, their milk is ultra filtered, so it provides more protein and calcium than regular milk. So it's 13 grams of protein per 8 ounces versus 8 grams that regular milk provides and versus 1 gram that something like almond milk provides. And none of these products contain lactose, even though they're all made with real milk. It's part of that ultra filtered process. So it's really nice to have real milk without the lactose, just in case you have lactose intolerance issues. So I've been using Core Power for years now, and I just recently noticed this new product, this Fairlife Nutrition Plan, when I was at Costco a month or so ago. It's very similar to Core Power, and Core Power has 170 calories and 26 grams of protein, and it comes in a variety of flavors, including vanilla, chocolate, banana, strawberry banana, and there's also an elite vanilla with 42 grams of protein. I don't really use that one. Oh, and the Core Power beverage is in a 14-ounce bottle. The Fairlife Nutrition Plan is in an 11.5-ounce bottle, and it has 150 calories and 30 grams of protein. So I really like that because, as we talked about on the podcast episode with Dr. Layman, we're really aiming for that 30-gram dose or load. So I really like this new Fairlife Nutrition Plan. Oh, and the flavors that this comes in is chocolate, strawberry, vanilla, salted caramel, and coffee. The ones that I bought at Costco were chocolate, and when I just went back the other day, they had the salted caramel, so I got that, and it is yummy. What I especially love about these two shakes, if you will, they call them shakes, is that not only do they taste great, they're really light. They're not heavy or thick. So if I'm not especially hungry or I just need something to hold me over, it's just right. So a couple of other simple things that I like to eat. I love cottage cheese with sunflower seeds. You can do low-fat cottage cheese. 1 cup is about 26 grams of protein, and a tablespoon of sunflower seeds adds another 4 grams of protein. And I also love using canned tuna or canned salmon as a quick lunch, either, mixed up with a little bit of mayonnaise and put on bread or crackers or topped on a salad. Oh, and I'm not a big fan of bars, really, but I do like to have them on hand just in case, or especially when I'm traveling. So my favorite is called the Think Bar. Those come in 10 gram or 20 gram options, and Quest bars are pretty good too. So those are a couple of options that you might want to check out. So again, I would love to hear how you boost or modify your protein intake, what some of your favorite foods or products are. So drop me a message in the show notes or connect with me by email or social media. Thanks again for staying tuned for this bonus content in the outro, and I look forward to sharing another episode with you soon. Till then, take care.
For more information, visit soundbitesrd.com. Music by Dave Burke, produced by Jag in Detroit Podcasts.